So when I'm creating sounds, I'm thinking of playability on the whole neck of the guitar first and foremost. I'm not necessarily connecting a specific note to a particular place. That comes second, because I want to free myself to be able to perhaps have zones on my guitar neck for different kinds of instruments. Or if I want to reverse the tuning so that the highest E string will generate the lowest notes, I want to be able to do that as well. I don't want to be stuck in this idea of anything having to be in a particular way. So these examples that I'm going to provide here are ways of facilitating playability when it comes to MIDI guitar. They may not sound that conspicuous, or they may not even sound like there's much thought having gone into them. But if you think of this first example that I had, this is really a two-part sound. Here I'm using a MIDI output from MIDI guitar, sending the signal out from the MIDI guitar software into a harmonizer, sending it out from the harmonizer and then back into MIDI guitar again, into an electric piano from the Falcon or UVI key suite. This is harmonizing the signal and sending it back in a shape of diminished chords, which are rotating in terms of how they are constructed. If you play the same note all the time, you'll hear the actual chords reconstruct in a particular order. But to not have every note generate a chord, which would sound a bit too much, I guess, I also have an expression pedal to cut out the notes that I don't want. So as I'm playing a note that I want to generate a chord, I'm leaving the expression pedal up. But as soon as I'm pressing that down, that chord will ring on, and I can play the second part of this sound, which is the Softube Model 72, which is a monosynth. In this monosynth, I can choose from having priority on the lowest note or on the highest note or on the latest note, depending on which effect I'm looking for. And this is really important when it comes to how you want the synth to react, because if I'm striking a chord, letting that ring until the next note and the next note, but leaving the lowest note always there, you'll only hear the lowest note ring out. But if I'm setting priority on the latest note, you'll hear every note change as a new note being played. And this brings a lot to the table when it comes to creating these compound sounds, or these layered sounds, because obviously it's going to sound like there are two different instruments, and it's up to you to actually create something interesting with this. So here's the possibility for you to create some chords and melody at the same time, and they don't have to be that related really. And this is one of the ways that I do this. Another obvious way to build your sounds is to build them in layers that you can interact with in different ways. So I'm using a breath controller here for the bass clarinet, whilst using a expression pedal to decide when and where a particular sound is to come in and go out. So in this soundscape, I'm using one of my favorite developers of let's call it instruments, but they're really more than that. Inouye samples, I think it's a French guy. This is sort of an extension of a bass clarinet. So I'm having this bass clarinet at the center of everything, and that's a traditional Swam bass clarinet. I'm controlling two aspects of that. Breath is controlling the expression, so the more I breathe into it, or the harder I breathe into this, the more expressive this sound would be. But I have also bite connected to it. And with this bite control, I will also access the overblowing effect of this particular instrument. Building around this instrument, I'm particularly fond of this Inouye Samples stack and slap baritone library that I have, that has these tonal mouth slap effects as well as the key sounds from the baritone sound. It really doesn't matter to me that it is sounds for a baritone instrument that I'm putting together with the Swam bass clarinet. I'm looking for the bigger part effect here. And also together with the bowed guitar string from Inouye Samples. You'll hear it in the beginning and you hear it in the end. And this is sort of a slow effect, so it doesn't come in if I'm not keeping a chord for a long time. You don't have to control it coming in and going out. It's only an effect if you let something ring out. You'll hear something in the background that sounds like a synth. It's a third instrument from Inouye Samples. It's the clarinet multiphonics that I'm using. This I'm also using with the breath controller. So I'm using the breath controller both to control the Swam instrument and the clarinet multiphonics. But I have the clarinet multiphonics on an expression pedal, so I can cut that out if I don't want it for the parts that I don't want to have this effect. And I also have a pretty long reverb on the multiphonics that I'm controlling with both the breath controller and an expression pedal for this particular setup. So whilst this doesn't sound especially complex, it sounds like something that you perhaps believe you could create in Pigments or whatever. But it really isn't. It's a fine-tuned instrument where I can decide exactly on where I'm coming in with different parts of this instrument. This is really a multi-layered instrument, even though it sounds pretty simple, I guess, on the surface. So now over to a trick that I know works for Mac. I don't know if that's an option available for PC as well, but I'm a Mac guy, so here goes. I'm going into my computer's audio MIDI device settings, creating this aggregate device from my GP10 and my Focusrite Scarlett. Opening this inside of something like Gig Performer, having both these inputs side by side as one audio interface. I can output both the 6 streams of audio from my hex pickup at the same time as I'm using my Focusrite connected to my MIDI Guitar 2. And why would I do this? Well, think of it like this. You have a lot of setups, you have a lot of presets in MIDI Guitar 3. Changing presets takes a little time. And if I'm only interested in changing something like the lead sound, I'm actually using MIDI Guitar 2 as a Rolodex for all of my Swam instruments because 1, it loads faster, and 2, I can switch seamlessly between these with program change messages in Gig Performer at the same time as I'm using CC messages to change patches up and down in MIDI Guitar 3. So I have 2 different ways of changing presets and patches, and I can have 1 patch and 1 lead instrument and just change the lead instruments in MIDI Guitar 2 seamlessly, and you wouldn't really notice. But the only thing I'm having here is just 1 patch in MIDI Guitar 3 and a Swam baritone sax in MIDI Guitar 2 with this special setup, just to show you that it's possible. Now to another deceptively simple setup, but it has a really profound effect. I'm using the old MIDI Guitar 2 on one track in Ableton, and I have a transposer on high velocity. So that means that when I'm picking something extra hard above that velocity threshold, it will pop up 2 octaves above the rest of the stuff. So when you use a reverb on this and perhaps your sustain pedal on the piano like this creates the effect of you playing both in the lower register and the high register. The lower rumbling stuff, since you don't have the amount of velocity, it's going to be a bit muddier, and anything that you really snap into will be more pronounced, more pristine, and you'll hear it, and it sounds more like a melody on top of something else, and it really sounds like two-handed playing. And also really important, I'm using a Max for Live plugin here to change the tuning, and the tuning is changed to, I think it's 4-note major chord. So the notes are no longer corresponding to any of the notes I'm playing on the guitar. So the guitar structure really doesn't have anything to do with it, but I'm sort of playing the white keys. You can still play anything that you remember from the C major shapes and scales. So superimpose your pentatonics on your C major scale as long as those notes go into that scale. So you can still do a lot of subsets and create a lot of interesting stuff that way. This way of playing MIDI guitar obviously depends heavily on you being able to accent. So perhaps you want to do something like connect your guitar to a snare drum, 2 velocity layers, to practice going between these two in a predictable way. So in the next clip, I have a very specific solution for anybody that's interested in using something like a breath controller for different instruments on different MIDI channels in whatever setup, if you have Contact, Omnisphere or Sample Tank or something like this. If I set up a multi in Contact, for instance, and I want to do this the way that I have each string has its own channel and perhaps its own instrument, or perhaps the same instrument but on different channels, so that I get this wonderful polyphony that we have in MPE as well. I can set that up in Contact that way, but anything that I send in on MIDI channel 1, mod wheel information or breath controller information, that would naturally come in on at least one channel at a time, would not be distributed out automatically to all of these other channels. And this is where the software solution comes in that I want to talk about today. And this is the Grumpy Monkey Distributor. It's an easy to use Contact script if you want to use it in Contact, and it also comes as a plugin. So if you want to use it together with, say, Sample Tank, which has exactly the same problem, or the Wallander Orchestra, a beautiful little small CPU footprint software that was discontinued in 2020, I think, but either way, I'm still using it. It's great, but it has this same problem. If I'm not using the Omni mode is the only way that I can sort of get my breath controller information out on all channels, but that also means that everything on all channels will sound at all times. And that's not perhaps what I'm interested in. I want to play, say, a soprano saxophone on my high E string, and I want to play some other instrument on my A string, for instance. But I want to control both of these with my breath controller for dynamics. I can do this with this little distributor that I'm going to show you here. So let's get into it. Let's start with a clean slate. I have a new patch here. Start with an instrument. In this case, I want to show you the multi-script for Contact. So I'll go for Native Instruments Contact 8 just because it's the new one. So the instrument I want to use right now is the sample modeling solo and ensemble strings. I'll just load these 4 instruments as is. I'm not doing anything special with them to begin with, so you'll see what it looks like. These will only be for 4 strings, obviously. So if I want to do this for a full guitar, I want 6 instances here, but this is for demonstrative purposes. So we don't want to use Omni, because if we use Omni, all of these instruments will sound at all times. I'll use MIDI channel 2 for the first one, MIDI channel 3 for the second one, MIDI channel 4 for the third one, and in this case I'll use MIDI channel 5 for these instruments specifically. There's a demand for something for expression. In this case they say that, warning, there's nothing in for CC11 that's supposed to be controlling the expression part. But I want to use a breath controller, so I'm going into the main menu here, setting this to breath controller, the same for all 4. This is just to give you a view of how easy or how tough it is to set up. I need to click these, so I'm telling these instances to listen for the CC2 coming in for the breath controller. As it is right now, I don't have anything connected obviously to Contact here, so it couldn't hear anything at this point anyway. So I want to connect my incoming breath controller from the MIDI patch bay in MIDI Guitar, and I can use this. Look at the MIDI CC2 halo here. You see that it reacts to me breathing into this, and I want my Contact 8 instance here to listen on CC2. So I'm clicking on CC2, I get this button, and I'm just connecting this with this cable like this. You see that CC2 lights up here as well. That means that Contact is getting this information as well. When these instruments get the information they need for the expression purposes, this warning box will disappear. But you see that it hasn't. And that's because I haven't distributed the incoming CC2 that is now coming in on MIDI channel 1 only out to these different instances. If I click the KSP button here, and I go into the presets here, and I get into the user part, and I have the distributor here. Nothing coming in right now, but if I breathe into this, you'll see that something happens. Now it realized that, okay, there's information coming in here. It's coming in on channel 1, and it's going out on channel 1 as it's set up. If I click on this, on the other hand, I get the option of sending it out to all of these channels as well. I can use the all alternative, or I can use none, and I can choose specifically these 2 to 5 in this case that I'm using. You'll see that now when I'm breathing into this, all of these will go out because the information, the breath controller information coming in here is going out. It's not here. Why is that? Yeah, put this on the wrong channel actually. So if I'm putting it to port A from host, the other ones are not available. So you'll see that it disappears as well. Good to know. You'll need to use the port that the host is using here, and the middle channels from that, of course. Anything else is a mistake. So here's another way to set up. I want to show you how to set up with a plugin as well. So in this case, I'm using the DDMF Meta plugin Synth here. That works like a plugin host, and I'm using this in MIDI Guitar to be able to use this Wallander instrument orchestra that I was talking about. So here we have the MIDI input, so everything comes in via this MIDI input. So I've connected my breath controller to CC2, so that goes directly to the distributor here. looks the same way, and here I've used all the channels available. Then we have the Wallander Instruments soundstage here. Here I decide what kind of channels I'm using. For the trumpet I'm using MIDI channel 3. For the saxophone I'm using MIDI channel 4 and so on. These instruments are all on a per string basis, so I'm using one kind of instrument per string in this case to add to this. The audio from the Wallander orchestra is then going out to the audio output and out on this chain and into the mixer, of course. So but the thing is, I can use any of these plugins, and I can also use these MIDI plugins that aren't an option in MIDI Guitar 3. I can equally as well use this in Logic or in Ableton as well, just by opening this as a plugin before the actual instrument in the chain of events. So this video is kind of a response to a request for more details when it comes to setting up. And this is how I set up. I'm pretty sure that you're gonna set up differently with different kinds of instruments. If you're really interested in discussing some particular about some setup, you're welcome to join my Patreon. Until next time, see you and bye.